On October 13, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 departed from Mendoza, Argentina at 2:18 p.m. local time. On board were 45 people, 40 passengers, 5 crew members. Most of the passengers were members of the Old Christians Club rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay. They were traveling to Santiago, Chile, for a friendly match. The group consisted largely of university students between 18 and 25 years old. A few family members and supporters accompanied them. The aircraft was a Fairchild FH-227D, a twin-engine turboprop designed for short regional routes. It was not built for high-altitude mountain crossings under severe weather conditions, but such crossings were not uncommon in South America. The flight the day before had been postponed due to heavy cloud cover over the Andes. Overnight, weather conditions marginally improved. Marginal, not ideal. The Andes Mountains form the longest continental mountain range in the world, stretching approximately 7,000 kilometers along the western edge of South America. In several sectors, peaks exceed 20,000 feet. Wind patterns in the region are unstable. Downdrafts and turbulence are frequent. Rapid weather shifts are normal. In 1972, aircraft navigation relied heavily on dead reckoning, estimating position using time, speed, heading, and wind correction. GPS did not exist. Terrain radar was limited. A miscalculation of wind speed could place an aircraft miles from its assumed position. At approximately 3 p.m., after nearly 1 hour of flight, the crew believed they had passed the most dangerous peaks of the Andes. Based on their estimated time over the mountain range, they requested permission from Chilean air traffic control to begin descending toward Santiago. Permission was granted. The aircraft began its descent. But the assumption was incorrect. Strong headwinds had reduced their ground speed significantly. The aircraft was still deep within the mountain range. At 3:34 p.m., the cloud layer briefly cleared. Directly ahead was a ridge. The pilots attempted to increase altitude. There was insufficient time. The right wing struck the mountain at approximately 13,800 feet above sea level. The impact tore the wing off immediately. Seconds later, the left wing separated. Without wings, lift was eliminated. The tail section detached, exposing the rear of the fuselage to open air. The remaining cylindrical body of the aircraft, still containing passengers, continued forward before gravity pulled it downward onto a steep glacial slope. It slid over ice and snow for several hundred meters before finally coming to rest at approximately 11,000 feet elevation. Inside the fuselage, the violence was immediate and indiscriminate. Seats broke loose from their anchors. Passengers were thrown forward. Metal fragments penetrated the cabin. 12 people died on impact. Several others sustained severe injuries, broken femurs, compound fractures, spinal trauma, concussions, internal bleeding. The temperature outside was well below freezing. The crash had lasted less than 30 seconds. The survival phase began immediately. There was no organized command structure. The surviving passengers assessed one another. Medical students among the group improvised triage using basic first aid knowledge. Seat cushions were used as splints. Torn clothing became bandages. Those with catastrophic injuries were made as comfortable as possible. The fuselage, though damaged, provided partial shelter from wind. Outside, there were no trees, no vegetation, no visible path, only snow and silence. Day 1. Stabilization. There was no organized command structure. The surviving passengers assessed one another. Medical students among the group improvised triage using basic first aid knowledge. Seat cushions were used as splints. Torn clothing became bandages. Those with catastrophic injuries were made as comfortable as possible. The fuselage, though damaged, provided partial shelter from wind. Outside, there were no trees, no vegetation, no visible path, only snow and silence. That first night, temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia becomes life-threatening when core body temperature falls below 35 degrees Celsius. At 32 degrees, cardiac arrhythmias become likely. The survivors pressed together to conserve body heat. They did not sleep. They endured. Day 2-3. Resource assessment. Morning light revealed the scale of isolation. The aircraft was lodged in a high-altitude glacial basin, surrounded by towering peaks on all sides. The terrain was deceptive. Slopes appeared manageable, but concealed crevasses and unstable snow layers. Inventory was conducted. Food recovered from luggage and the aircraft galley included 8 chocolate bars, several small jars of jam, peanuts, candies, a few bottles of wine. Total estimated caloric supply, approximately 10,000 calories. Divided among 27 able survivors, this equaled less than 400 calories per person total, not per day, total. A young adult male at high altitude in cold conditions requires between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day to maintain body weight. Starvation would begin rapidly. Rationing was immediate. 1 small piece of chocolate per day. A sip of wine diluted with melted snow. Snow could not be eaten directly. Doing so lowers core body temperature. Instead, snow was melted using pieces of aluminum exposed to sunlight. Search aircraft were heard during the first few days. The group attempted to create visible signals using seat covers placed on the snow. White against white is nearly invisible from the air. Day 4-7. Physical decline begins. Injured passengers continued to deteriorate. One of the most severely injured, the team captain Marcelo Perez, attempted to maintain morale. Leadership emerged gradually. Decisions were discussed collectively, but authority began to centralize informally. Hunger intensified. Physiologically, the body first depletes glycogen reserves stored in liver and muscle, typically within 24 hours. After that, metabolism shifts toward fat breakdown. Once fat reserves diminish, muscle protein becomes the primary energy source. By the end of the first week, dizziness was common. Standing required effort. Cognitive sharpness began to dull. On the 8th day, a small transistor radio was repaired using scavenged batteries. The survivors gathered to listen to news reports. The announcement was clear. The official search operation had been terminated. No survivors were expected. Silence followed. One survivor later recalled someone saying quietly, "Then we have to save ourselves." The psychological shift was immediate. Hope in rescue transitioned into responsibility for action.
The ethical decision. By the end of the second week, food supplies were exhausted. Starvation was no longer theoretical. Bodies of those who had died in the crash remained outside, preserved by sub-zero temperatures. At those temperatures, decomposition does not occur. Tissue remains biologically intact. The discussion lasted days. Most of the group were practicing Catholics. Cannibalism was morally unthinkable. Yet death by starvation was approaching with measurable certainty. One argument reframed the issue. If we were to die, wouldn't we want our bodies used to keep the others alive? Another survivor later described the decision not as an act of desperation, but as an extension of mutual sacrifice. No one was forced. Small pieces of frozen tissue were cut using shards of metal and glass. The meat was dried slightly in sunlight. The first consumption was silent. No one made eye contact. But protein intake stabilized their physical decline. Without it, medical analysis suggests survival beyond 30 days would have been unlikely.
Day 17. The avalanche. Night. The avalanche struck after midnight. There was no warning beyond a distant, low-frequency rumble. A sound some later described as thunder without sky. Within seconds, compacted snow entered through the exposed rear section of the fuselage. It filled the interior like concrete. Those closest to the opening were buried instantly. Darkness became absolute. Breathing became mechanical. Snow compressed against chests, restricting expansion of the lungs. Carbon dioxide accumulated rapidly in confined air pockets. Survival depended not on strength, but on remaining still. One survivor later described consciously slowing his breathing to avoid suffocation. The burial lasted hours. When small movements became possible, the digging began. Hands, fragments of metal, seat frames. 8 more bodies were recovered by morning. Among them was Marcelo Perez, who had gradually become a stabilizing leader. Leadership would now shift, not formally, but functionally.
Day 18 to 20. Reorganization. The avalanche changed structural reality. The fuselage was now half buried in hardened snow. Insulation improved. Ventilation decreased. A small air tunnel was maintained to prevent suffocation. Psychologically, something shifted. Before the avalanche, they were survivors of a crash. After it, they were survivors of the mountain itself. Grief was present, but muted. Energy conservation dominated conversation. Caloric intake was slightly stabilized due to protein consumption. Weight loss, however, accelerated. Muscle atrophy became visible. Cheekbones sharpened. Ribs protruded. Standing up required deliberate effort. Sleep became fragmented. Dreams were often about food.
Day 21 to 25. The first long expedition attempt. With search efforts long abandoned, discussion turned towards self-rescue.
The assumption was simple. Chile lay west, Argentina lay east, but distance was unknown. An exploratory team climbed toward a nearby ridge. The climb revealed scale distortion. What appeared close required 6 hours of ascent. At the summit, they saw not valleys, but additional ridges, layer after layer of mountains. The realization was demoralizing. They were deeper inside the Andes than assumed. Returning to the fuselage required as much energy as the climb itself. Caloric deficit intensified. Every failed expedition cost body mass.
Day 26 to 30. Physical degradation. By the 4th week, starvation physiology was advanced. Fat reserves had significantly diminished. Muscle catabolism accelerated. Movement required mental override. Standing too quickly caused dizziness. Minor cuts healed slowly. Cold tolerance decreased. Hypothermic shivering became more frequent at night. Despite protein intake, total calories remained extremely low. Mood fluctuations increased. Some became withdrawn. Others became hyper-focused on logistics. One survivor later stated, "We stopped talking about rescue. We started talking about kilometers." Time perception blurred. Days were counted manually. They tracked them by marking interior metal with scratches. Day 31-35. Strategic shift. The group began to accept a fundamental truth. No one was coming. Waiting meant gradual organ failure. The only viable scenario was crossing the mountains. But crossing required preparation. A sleeping system became priority. Nighttime exposure without protection would kill climbers within hours. Aircraft insulation was removed. Seat covers were layered. Electrical wiring from the aircraft was extracted and used as thread. A makeshift sleeping bag was constructed. It took days. Hands were cracked and bleeding from cold, but the bag was finished. This marked a psychological turning point. For the first time, there was forward intention. Day 36 to 40. Weather window. Storm systems passed through repeatedly. High-altitude weather shifts are violent and rapid. Wind speeds exceeded 80 kilometers per hour at times. Blowing snow reduced visibility to near zero. Expedition plans were postponed. Waiting continued. But now, waiting had purpose. Protein reserves were rationed more carefully to support the planned climb. Body weight had decreased dramatically. Several survivors had lost more than 20 kilograms. Muscle fibers were visibly reduced. Yet cognitive clarity had paradoxically improved. Starvation sharpens focus when survival depends on it.
Day 41 to 45. Final decision. Nando Parrado emerged as a central driving force. His motivation was anchored in one thought. His mother had died in the crash. His sister was critically injured but alive for several days before dying from injuries. He later stated, "I had nothing left to lose." Roberto Canessa, a medical student, understood physiological limits better than most. They calculated remaining strength. If they waited longer, muscle loss would make climbing impossible. If they left too early, storms would kill them. The decision was made around day 60 of total survival, but preparation intensified during this window. Antonio Vizintin would join them initially to help carry supplies. The rest would remain behind. It was not unanimous optimism. It was calculated risk. Day 46 to 60. The march begins. The departure occurred on December 12, 1972. Day 61 since the crash. They climbed immediately. The slope above the fuselage was steeper than it had appeared from below. Each step required kicking footholds into ice. Breathing was labored. Heart rate elevated rapidly due to altitude. Caloric intake before departure was minimal. They carried small strips of dried meat. No map, no compass. Direction was based on sun position. After 2 days of climbing, they reached what they believed to be the final ridge. From the summit, they saw endless peaks. Parado later described the moment as the lowest psychological point of the entire ordeal. The Andes stretched in every direction. The crash site was not near the Chilean border. It was deep within the range. Turning back meant inevitable physical decline. Continuing meant unknown distance. They continued. Day 61 to 68, crossing the spine. The terrain gradually shifted. Snow became intermittent. Rock faces replaced ice. They descended steep ravines. Nights were spent inside the improvised sleeping bag, pressed together for warmth. Temperature dropped below freezing each night. They rationed meat carefully. Each piece was measured. On day 68, they saw a change. Water flowed freely in a stream. Vegetation appeared. Then, in the distance, cattle. Cattle meant human presence. Energy surged despite depletion. Day 69. Contact. On December 20th, they saw a man on horseback across a river. The current was too strong to cross. Shouting failed due to wind and distance. A piece of paper was written. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. There are 14 injured people up there." The note was wrapped around a stone. Thrown. The shepherd, Sergio Catalan, retrieved it. He rode for hours to notify authorities. Day 70 to 72. Rescue helicopters were deployed. On December 22, 1972, rescue aircraft reached the crash site. Altitude limited load capacity. Evacuation required multiple trips. The survivors remaining at the fuselage saw helicopters descending through thin air. For many, it did not feel real. 72 days after impact, extraction was completed. 16 survivors remained alive. Final analysis. Average weight loss, 25 to 35% of original body mass. Severe muscle atrophy. Vitamin deficiencies. Psychological trauma. Medical consensus was direct. Without protein consumption, survival beyond 30-40 days would have been unlikely. The Andes did not become less hostile. Weather did not improve significantly.
What changed was adaptation under constraint. 45 boarded. 16 returned. Not because they were prepared, but because they continued making decisions when hope was no longer operational. Survival was not dramatic, it was incremental, and it lasted 72 days.
72 days in the Andes. 72 days of cold that did not negotiate, of hunger that did not pause, of isolation that did not soften. 16 people survived, not because help arrived in time, not because conditions improved, but because they adapted step by step to circumstances most of us will never experience. It is easy, decades later, to analyze their decisions from comfort, to debate morality from a heated room, to judge actions taken at 11,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures, under sustained starvation. But the mountain removed abstraction. There were no philosophical discussions about dignity when muscle tissue was being consumed by the body itself. There was only a question: continue or deteriorate? And that question repeated every day. When they chose to consume the bodies of the deceased, was it survival instinct? Was it moral compromise? Or was it a form of mutual sacrifice under extreme constraint? If you had been there, physically weakening, oxygen deprived, watching others fade, what would you have done? Would you have waited for rescue that had already been declared over? Would you have climbed into mountains that appeared endless? Would you have continued walking after realizing the first ridge was not the last? Or would you have accepted the clinical prediction: survival is not possible? The Andes did not change, human behavior did, and that may be the most unsettling part of this story, because it forces a deeper question. How much of what we call morality is built on stability? How much of our certainty depends on comfort? When survival becomes procedural, when it becomes measured in calories, oxygen, and body temperature, do our principles remain the same, or do they adapt? The 16 survivors did not describe themselves as heroes. Most described their actions as logical, necessary, inevitable. Which leaves us with a final thought. We often believe we know who we are, but we rarely know who we are under pressure. And perhaps that is why this story continues to endure. Not because of the crash, not because of the avalanche, not even because of what they ate, but because it confronts us with a quiet, uncomfortable possibility. In the right conditions, or the wrong ones, we are all capable of more than we imagine, for better or for survival.